Imagine a world where your very thoughts could condemn you, a time when speaking your mind, even in the quietest whisper, could shatter your entire existence. What if the most powerful forces in your life were poised to crush you for daring to utter an inconvenient truth? Welcome to 1105. Number 5. A hardscrabble existence. Speaking out meant starvation. Life in the year 1105 was not just tough, it was a daily struggle for survival for most people, especially for women living in the shadow of mighty castles and grand cathedrals. Forget your dreams of a 9-to-5 job or a steady paycheck. Countless women across the lands that would one day become France, England, or the Holy Roman Empire, existence was tied directly to the land, to the earth, to the rhythm of the seasons. Most women were peasants, tied to the soil and to the will of the local lord who owned it. Their entire lives revolved around planting, harvesting, tending to animals, grinding grain, spinning wool, and raising children. Think about a young woman named Elara, living in a small, smoky hut in a village nestled by a forest edge. Her days began before the sun, often with the milking of a bony cow or the tending of a few chickens. Her hands, rough and calloused from years of work, knew the feel of the earth intimately. Her very being was intertwined with the success of her family's meager plot of land. They might have a few acres, enough to grow wheat or barley, maybe a patch of beans or cabbages. This land wasn't theirs to own, it was leased from the Lord, and in return they paid him with a portion of their harvest, with days of labor on his fields and with loyalty. Now imagine Elara, despite the ever-present hunger and the bone-deep weariness, possessed a keen mind and a strong sense of justice. Perhaps her lord's reeve, the manager of his estate, was demanding an extra tithe, more grain than was due. Or maybe a local miller, who controlled the only mill for miles, was shortchanging the villagers, taking more than his fair share when grinding their precious grain. This was a common injustice, noted in historical accounts and manorial records from the period, where local officials or monopolists often abused their power. If Elara, or any woman like her, decided to speak out against such an injustice, what would happen? It wasn't just about making a complaint, it was about risking everything. Families' very survival depended on that small piece of land, on their ability to farm it without interference, and on the goodwill, however limited, of the Lord and his representatives. If she complained about the reeve, who was the Lord's man, she would not be met with a sympathetic ear in some formal court of law. There were no women's rights organizations, no legal aid societies, no independent media to report her plight. Her immediate danger would come from the very people who controlled her access to food. The reeve, insulted by her audacity, could easily make her family's life a living hell. He could assign them the worst plots of land the following year, land that was rocky or poorly drained. He could demand more labor from her husband or brothers on the Lord's domain, the Lord's own fields, forcing them away from their own crops during crucial planting or harvesting times. He could levy unfair fines for minor infractions, like a stray pig rooting in the wrong place, fines that her family could never hope to pay. And what about the miller? If Elara spoke out against his dishonesty, he could refuse to grind her family's grain at all. Think about that for a moment. In 1105, without a mill, grain could not be turned into flour. Without flour, there was no bread, the staple of the medieval diet. Her family would literally starve, slowly and painfully. She would be forced to grind her own grain with a hand quern, a laborious and inefficient process that yielded little usable flour, or to travel miles to another, more honest mill, assuming one existed and was accessible. The economic ripple effect of her defiance would be catastrophic. The danger wasn't just hypothetical. Medieval society was built on a pyramid of power. At the very top sat the king, then the great lords, then the lesser lords, and at the very bottom, the vast majority, were the peasants. Each layer depended on the one above for protection and stability, and each layer demanded obedience from the one below. Speaking out from the bottom was seen not just as a complaint, but as a challenge to the entire social order. It was a refusal to accept one's divinely ordained place. Moreover, a woman's economic standing was almost entirely tied to her male relatives, her father, then her husband, and later her sons. If a woman spoke out and her family suffered, she would be seen as the cause of their misfortune. Her husband, perhaps out of fear for their survival or out of traditional patriarchal authority, might silence her. Her family might ostracize her, fearing that her independent spirit would bring ruin upon them all. Common medieval saying, "A woman's wisdom is best kept in her head," reflects the prevailing view that a woman's public voice was a source of trouble. There were few avenues for peasant women to earn money independently. They might sell eggs, cheese, or simple woven goods at a local market, but these were small sums, rarely enough to survive on their own. Their livelihood was embedded in the collective family unit working the land. To be cast out of this unit, or for the unit to be crippled by the Lord's displeasure, was to face destitution. There were no social safety nets, no food banks, no government assistance. If you couldn't farm, you starved. If your family was ruined, you begged, or perhaps wandered the roads as a vagrant, a dangerous existence where violence and early death were constant companions. Even for women in slightly higher social classes, like the wives of prosperous merchants or craftsmen in towns, speaking out carried severe economic risks. A merchant's wife, though she might manage the household accounts and oversee apprentices, often worked as a partner in her husband's business. If she publicly challenged a powerful figure or spoke against an unfair guild rule, it could lead to her husband's business being boycotted, his trade licenses revoked, or his customers disappearing. The entire family's wealth, often tied up in goods and trade routes, could vanish overnight. She would be seen as jeopardizing the family's economic future, not protecting it. So for any woman in 1105, regardless of her humble social standing, the temptation to speak out against injustice was almost always outweighed by the terrifying reality of what it would mean for her stomach, her home, and the very survival of her family. Choice was often stark: endure the injustice or risk dying of hunger. Number 4, the Lord's hand, when power meant punishments. Beyond the threat of starvation, speaking out in 1105 for a woman often meant facing the direct, physical wrath of those in power. In a feudal society, power was highly localized and intensely personal. The lord of the manor, whether a baron, a count, or even a knight, held immense authority over the people on his lands. His word was often law, and his punishments could be swift, brutal, and without appeal. There were no independent police forces, no widely enforced codes of conduct that protected the average person from the caprice of a powerful individual. Consider the example of Lady Isolde, the wife of a lesser noble, perhaps in a small, isolated castle. Unlike her peasant counterparts, Isolde might have been educated, perhaps even able to read and write in Latin, a skill rare even among men of her time. She would have managed a large household, overseeing servants, organizing supplies, and perhaps even administering portions of the estate in her husband's absence. She might have had a strong sense of her own worth, honed by the responsibilities of her position. Now imagine Isolde discovers her husband, Lord Reynold, is committing a grave injustice. Perhaps he is seizing the lands of a neighboring family without cause, or brutally punishing a peasant family for a minor transgression. Chronicles from the time, like those of Orderic Vitalis, are filled with accounts of lords engaging in land disputes, private wars, and harsh justice against their own tenants. Isolde, driven by conscience or a sense of honor, dared to speak out against her husband's actions. She would face an immediate and terrifying danger. First, her husband's honor was paramount. A wife challenging her husband's decisions, especially in front of his retainers or other nobles, was an unforgivable offense. Undermined his authority, his masculinity, and his standing in a society where reputation was everything. He might view it not just as insubordination, but as a direct challenge to his power. His response could range from public humiliation to outright violence, a slap, a beating, or even worse, a prolonged period of confinement. Common punishment for disobedient or troublesome noblewomen was confinement within the castle. She might be locked in her chambers, denied visitors, or even imprisoned in a dungeon. This wasn't a formal, legal imprisonment with a trial date. It was simply the Lord exercising his absolute power within his own domain. A woman like Isolde could disappear from sight, her family or friends none the wiser, and there would be no official record of her fate. The Lord would simply state that his wife was ill or had chosen to retire from public life, and no one would question him. Historical accounts do mention instances of wives being confined or sent to convents against their will if they proved too troublesome for their powerful husbands. And what if the wrongdoer wasn't her husband, but a powerful local lord or a knight who held sway over their lands? Perhaps Lady Isolde witnesses this lord, Sir Cale, perpetrating violence against a young woman in the village, or plundering a church. If she were to speak out, to report this to a higher authority like a bishop or a more powerful count, she would be placing herself in direct danger. Sir Cale, with his armed retinue, would see her as a meddler, a threat to his reputation and his freedom to act as he pleased. He could intimidate her, send his men to threaten her family, or worse. The threat of physical violence, not just for herself but for those she loved, was a very real deterrent. Peasant women, the danger was even more immediate and less restrained. Peasant woman, let's call her Agnes, dared to speak out against a local lord who was demanding sexual favors or who was taking their crops without due payment. The consequences could be devastating. The lord's power was absolute. He could order his men to beat her, to rape her, or to drive her family from their land. These were not mere threats. Historical records from the period, though often sanitized, hint at the brutal realities of life under unchecked feudal power. The jus primi noctis, or right of the first night, though its historical extent is debated, reflects the widespread belief in a lord's ultimate sexual power over his female subjects. Imagine Agnes witnessing her younger sister being harassed by the lord's son. Her instinct to protect her sister, to cry out against the injustice, would be tempered by the cold, hard reality of their vulnerability. If she yelled, if she resisted, she could face immediate physical harm. There was no one to appeal to. The lord's son was above the law, or rather, he was the law in their village. Her defiance would be met with swift and painful retribution, not just for her, but for her entire family, who would then live under the lord's unforgiving gaze. Even a public verbal challenge, a sharp retort to a lord or a knight, could be met with a swift blow. Honor was a delicate thing in the Middle Ages, and any perceived disrespect, especially from someone considered beneath them, could ignite a violent reaction. A woman who talked back or spoke out of turn was seen as challenging the social order, and such challenges were often put down with force. The absence of any formal protection for women against physical abuse was glaring. A husband had legal authority over his wife, and while some church teachings condemned excessive cruelty, in practice, a husband's physical discipline of his wife was generally accepted within the bounds of his right to maintain order in his household. A powerful lord or knight had similar latitude over his tenants. For women, speaking out meant risking not just abstract concepts like reputation or legal standing, but risking their own bodies, their safety, and even their lives at the whim of those who held all the power. The threat of pain and violence was a constant shadow, forcing silence. Number 3, no voice, no rights, the iron grip of the law. In 1105, the legal landscape for women was a tangled web of customary laws, church decrees, and the sheer power of local lords. But one truth stood out with chilling clarity. Women had very little legal standing and almost no independent voice within the justice system. Imagine trying to argue your case, to defend yourself, or to accuse a wrongdoer when the very rules of the game were designed to silence you. Let's think about Lady Elara, a widow of modest means whose husband has just passed away. In some regions, she might have the right to a dower, a portion of her deceased husband's estate for her support, usually 1/3. This was a crucial lifeline for widows. But imagine her late husband's grasping brother, or a powerful neighbor, decides to challenge her claim, perhaps arguing that the marriage was invalid, or that the land was not truly her husband's to begin with. Elara would find herself in a perilous situation. She could not easily represent herself in court. Legal proceedings in the 12th century were complex, often oral, and involved specific forms of oaths and testimonies. Women were generally not permitted to act as witnesses in court, especially in cases where a man's word was at stake, or to bring a lawsuit in their own name without a male guardian or prachin ami, next friend, to represent them. This guardian was often a male relative, a father, brother, or son, who would speak on her behalf or even make decisions for her. If she had no such relative, or if her relative was unwilling or unable to help, she was effectively stripped of any legal recourse. Consider a scene in a local manorial court where disputes over land, debts, and minor offenses were settled. Here, the lord or his steward presided. If Elara tried to argue her own case, she might be met with scoffing and dismissal. Her words would carry little weight compared to the sworn testimony of men. This legal disadvantage was not an oversight. It was deeply embedded in the societal structures of the time. Canon law, the law of the church, which influenced secular law significantly, also held that women were generally not fit to hold public office or to speak in public assemblies or courts, often citing interpretations of scripture about women's place. What if Elara was the victim of a crime, perhaps a theft or an assault? Reporting it would be challenging enough. Getting justice would be even harder. Her testimony alone might not be enough to secure a conviction. Perpetrator, if male, might simply deny her account, and the court might be inclined to believe him, especially if he was a man of standing or wealth. There was no real concept of due process, as we understand it today, and the scales of justice were heavily tipped against women. Marriage itself was a legal institution that stripped women of many independent rights. Once married, a woman became feme covert, meaning she was legally covered by her husband. Her property, if she had any, typically passed to his control. She could not enter into contracts, buy or sell land, or make a will without her husband's consent and often his direct involvement. Her legal identity was essentially subsumed into his. This meant that if she spoke out against a dishonest merchant her husband was dealing with, or complained about an unfair tax collector, her words had no legal force. Any action would have to be taken by her husband, who might not share her concerns or might fear the repercussions. Even if a woman were a highly respected figure, like an abbess of a powerful convent, her legal authority was still circumscribed. While she might govern her community and its lands, she would still likely need a male bishop or a powerful noble to represent her interests in the wider secular courts or to enforce certain decrees. The story of Perilous and Abelard, though a complex one of love and intellectual pursuit in the same century, highlights the limited choices even highly intelligent women had, often ending in the cloister, a path that offered spiritual fulfillment, but also removed them from the direct legal and social battles of the secular world. The legal system was designed by men, for men, and operated overwhelmingly to protect the interests of men, particularly those of property and power. A woman's only real protection within this system was through her male relatives, her father, who would arrange her marriage and protect her dowry, or her husband, who was legally bound to provide for and protect her. But if these men were the source of the injustice, or if they were unwilling or unable to act, a woman had no independent legal path. Think of a woman accused of a minor transgression, perhaps of poaching a rabbit on the Lord's land, a desperate act to feed her family. In court, she might try to explain her circumstances, to plead for mercy. But her words would be filtered through the rigid framework of medieval law. She wouldn't have a lawyer. Such professions were nascent and only for the wealthy. Fate would rest on the Lord Steward's interpretation of customary law, often based on ancient precedents and local power dynamics, with little room for individual appeal or empathy. The law was an instrument of power, not necessarily of justice, and it was wielded by men. The lack of legal voice meant that a woman who spoke out, whether against injustice or against her own treatment, was speaking into a void. There was no established framework to hear her, to validate her claims, or to enforce her rights. Her words, no matter how true or how urgent, could simply be ignored, or worse, used against her as evidence of insubordination or madness. The legal system was an iron cage, and for women, it was a cage without a key. Number 2, the unspoken rules, when your reputation was your only shield. In the intricate tapestry of medieval society, a woman's reputation was not just a matter of pride. It was often her most valuable asset, her only true shield against ruin. In 1105, whispers could destroy lives, and social standing was a fragile thing, constantly under scrutiny. For a woman to speak out, to challenge norms, or to voice an unpopular opinion, was to invite a barrage of social condemnation that could leave her utterly isolated and destitute. Imagine a woman named Mariana, a skilled weaver living in a bustling market town. Her livelihood depended on the trust of her customers and the goodwill of her neighbors. She lived in a close-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business. Reputation was everything. If Mariana were to speak out against a powerful guild master who was unfair, or against a corrupt town official, her words wouldn't just be heard by those directly involved. They would echo through the entire town, bouncing off the walls of the marketplace, whispered in the church, and debated in the taverns. The immediate danger was social ostracism. Mariana was seen as a troublemaker, a contentious woman, or one who speaks out of turn. people would begin to avoid her. Customers might stop buying her woven goods, fearing association with someone who challenged authority. Other women might shun her, fearing that her reputation would taint theirs. In a society where economic survival depended on community cooperation and trust, being socially isolated was akin to a death sentence. There were no anonymous online forums for her to express her views. Every word spoken in public was tied directly to her and her family. This ostracism was not a minor inconvenience, it was a systemic punishment. If a woman couldn't sell her goods, she couldn't earn. If she was excluded from communal gatherings, she lost access to networks of support and information. If her neighbors gossiped about her, it could damage her family's standing and make it difficult for her children to find suitable spouses. Marriage was a critical social and economic institution in 1105, a means of securing alliances and consolidating property. A woman with a bad reputation or a history of speaking out would be considered an undesirable match, potentially dooming her daughters to spinsterhood or her sons to marrying women from far below their social standing. For noblewomen, the stakes of reputation were even higher. A noblewoman's honor was intrinsically tied to that of her husband and her family. Comportment, her obedience, and her silence on matters of public contention were vital to maintaining her family's prestige and power. If a woman like Lady Guinevere, the wife of a powerful count, dared to speak out against her husband's actions or against the king's policies, she would be branded unruly, disloyal, or even mad. Such accusations, though not legal condemnations, were often far more damaging. A reputation for disloyalty could lead to her husband being ostracized by the court, losing favor with the king, or having his lands confiscated. Her family's power, built over generations, could crumble. Children would suffer from the disgrace, unable to make advantageous marriages or pursue ecclesiastical career. Lady Guinevere herself might be sent to a convent, not necessarily as a formal punishment, but as a convenient way for her family to control her and protect their reputation. It was a common fate for noblewomen who were deemed problematic or no longer useful for dynastic alliances. The source of information about women's reputations in this period comes from various chronicles and monastic records that occasionally mention women's actions, both virtuous and scandalous. These narratives often reflect the prevailing societal values that praised modesty, obedience, and silence in women, while condemning outspokenness or defiance. The very language used to describe women who challenged norms was laden with negative connotations. Moreover, the power of slander and rumor was immense in a time before widespread literacy or independent media. A malicious whisper, started by an enemy or a jealous rival, could spread like wildfire, destroying a woman's character without any chance for her to defend herself. There were no libel laws that women could effectively use. If a woman spoke out and her words were twisted, misrepresented, or deliberately misconstrued, she had no platform to correct the record. Truth would be buried under a mountain of lies, and the community would be more inclined to believe the negative gossip than her lone, defiant voice. This vulnerability to social condemnation meant that women were often conditioned from a young age to be silent, to be compliant, and to prioritize the maintenance of their family's honor above their own opinions or desires. Fear of being branded unwomanly or shameless was a powerful deterrent. It wasn't just about losing friends. It was about losing your place in the world, your means of support, and your very identity within a community that demanded conformity. For a woman in 1105, speaking out was a gamble with the highest stakes: her standing, her family's future, and her entire social existence. Her reputation was not just a pleasant adornment, it was the invisible barrier protecting her from ruin. Challenge, it was to expose herself to the chilling winds of isolation and destitution. Number 1, the church's shadow, accusations that could end more than your life. In 1105, the church was not just a religious institution, it was a dominant force in every aspect of life. Its influence permeated politics, law, education, and daily existence. It held immense power over the minds and souls of people, offering salvation, but also wielding the terrifying threat of eternal damnation. For a woman speaking out, particularly on matters that could be interpreted as questioning religious authority or delving into forbidden knowledge, meant stepping into the chilling shadow of accusations that could destroy not only her earthly life, but also her hope for the afterlife. Consider a woman like Agnes, a village healer. She knew the ancient remedies, passed down from her mother and grandmother, for fevers, broken bones, and women's ailments. She understood the properties of herbs, the quiet power of certain prayers, and the wisdom of folk traditions. In a world without trained doctors, her skills were vital, sought out by desperate villagers. But what if Agnes, in her practice, encountered something she couldn't explain, or perhaps offered advice that subtly challenged the Church's teachings on suffering or miracle? Or what if, driven by a deep spiritual curiosity, she started to interpret Scripture in her own way, perhaps discussing these ideas with other women? This was a dangerous path. The Church in 1105, while not yet engaged in the widespread witch hunts of later centuries, was deeply concerned with heresy and sorcery. Accusations of maleficium, causing harm through magic, or consorting with evil spirits were present. Women, often seen as more susceptible to temptation due to interpretations of biblical figures like Eve, were particularly vulnerable to such charges. Agnes's healing methods seemed too effective, too mysterious, or her independence too pronounced. A fearful neighbor or a zealous local priest might accuse her of sorcery or of being in league with malevolent forces. Such accusations, even if unfounded, were almost impossible to shake off. The process was terrifyingly arbitrary. There were no impartial scientific investigations into her remedies. Instead, the priest or bishop would rely on testimony, often fueled by fear, jealousy, or long-standing grudges. Agnes were to speak out against her accusers, to vehemently deny the charges. Her defiance could be interpreted as further evidence of her guilt, of a hardened heart, or even a demonic influence. Her very words, intended to defend, could become weapons against her. Heresy was an even graver charge. The Church held a monopoly on interpreting divine will and Scripture. Any individual, especially a woman, who dared to express theological ideas that deviated from established dogma, or who preached without ecclesiastical permission, was considered a profound threat to the spiritual order. We have accounts from this period of various spiritual movements, some of which attracted female followers and which were eventually condemned by the Church. A woman, perhaps moved by intense religious devotion, spoke out about a personal revelation or challenged the wealth and corruption of the clergy, a common complaint in the 12th century, she could find herself branded a heretic. Punishments for heresy were severe, ranging from excommunication, a terrifying spiritual death sentence that cut one off from God's grace and the community, to imprisonment, and in some cases, even execution. While burning at the stake for heresy became more common in later centuries, other forms of capital punishment or severe corporal punishment were certainly possible. A woman accused of heresy would be subject to ecclesiastical courts, which operated under their own rules, often prioritizing the purity of doctrine over individual rights. She would have no true legal defense, no one to speak for her against the might of the Church. Her own testimony, if it contradicted the Church's interpretation, would condemn her. Think of Hildegard of Bingen, a remarkable abbess and mystic who lived in the same century. While she was ultimately celebrated for her visions and writings, her early experiences were marked by doubt and skepticism from Church authorities. Her ability to speak out, to describe her visions, and to write about them was only possible due to her exceptional intelligence, her high social standing as an abbess, and crucially, the validation she eventually received from powerful male figures within the Church, including Saint Bernard of Clairvaux and even the Pope. Most women had no such patrons or protection. A common woman claimed to have visions. She would be more likely accused of demonic possession or madness than divine inspiration. Even for simpler matters, like a woman challenging a local priest's authority or speaking critically of a saint's relic, she risked being labeled impious or irreligious. These accusations, though not as severe as heresy, could still lead to social ruin, as devout villagers would shun her. She might be denied communion, banned from church services, or even publicly shamed. In a society where the Church was the center of community life and the source of salvation, being cast out from its embrace was a fate almost worse than death. The Church's influence was not just about punishment, it shaped the very way women were perceived. Teachings derived from biblical interpretations often emphasized women's inherent weakness, their need for male guidance, and their secondary role in spiritual matters. To speak out, especially on a theological point, was to defy centuries of established doctrine and risk being seen as a dangerous, independent thinker, a role profoundly unsettling to the religious authorities of the time. The shadow of the church was long and terrifying, and for any woman who dared to challenge its authority or step beyond its prescribed boundaries, the consequences could be absolute and eternally damning.